Shaw TV, your local voice.
Doug White is a member and former chief of the Snuneymuxw First Nation here in Nanaimo. His Coast Salish name is Kwul'a'sul'tun. After completing his BA in First Nation Studies with distinction at Malaspina University-College, also now known as Vancouver Island University, he graduated from the Faculty of Law at the University of Victoria in 2006 and was called to the Bar of British Columbia in 2008. He's been a director of the Indigenous Bar Association of Canada and an associate lawyer at Mandell Pinder. He currently is the director of the Center for Pre-Confederation Treaties and Reconciliation at Vancouver Island University, based here in Nanaimo, and practices as a lawyer and negotiator across the country for First Nation governance. He has recently been a counselor for Snuneymuxw First Nation and frequently lectures at universities on Indigenous legal issues. Please welcome Doug White.
Thank you very much, Jen. Asiem na siaya, Ainthapek Kwul'a'sul'tun tani Snuneymuxw, Ait na Shkwala'wan konas I haitsepka siam estimo. Good morning, everyone. My name is Doug White. My Coast Salish name is Kwul'a'sul'tun. My Nuu-chah-nulth name is Tlii'shin. It's a great honor for me to be here with you all on this morning, gathered up here in this building to talk about this remarkable issue. I confess I couldn't remember what David Whitty asked me to talk about up until recently, and I took a look and I thought, oh, I got very excited about it. I thought this is a perfect topic. What an important and timely issue for us all to be thinking about. I really appreciate the invitation to come. I thank all of the organizers for creating this space for this kind of an opportunity to share a few words about such a critical issue in our society. I'm going to talk about a number of things. I know that I assume most of you are architects. And I gave a talk a year or two ago at the SCARP Symposium at UBC on a slightly different topic, but where I think that there's some important information and reflections that come out of that talk that I want to share with you today. The theme there was about decolonialism in the context of today with respect to architectural issues. And here today, of course, we're talking about what are the implications of Aboriginal title for Canadian governance. And this is I've been talking about this issue now for a couple of years very intensively. Since the summer of 2014, what's the date today? We're in June now. So in June 26, 2014, 6:35 in the morning, Pacific Standard Time, the Supreme Court of Canada issued one of its most historic decisions that it's ever issued, of profound and sweeping consequence to this country, to everybody in this country. This decision, the Kwul'a'sul'tun Nation decision about Aboriginal title, was the answer to what was called for many, many years, for over a century, the Indian land question. And so I'm going to talk about that story, and it's a remarkable story here in British Columbia and in this country. I'll tell something about it, how that decision came to be, a little bit about what the decision said, and specifically, what are the implications of that decision for Canadian governance, for how we go about making decisions, recognizing authority, structuring authority and decision-making power and jurisdiction, and how we use that in our lived lives. I want you to know that I think that this particular issue and this particular moment we're in has a very clear, high-level, big-picture dimensions to it. We have to look at the very architecture of this country, legally speaking, politically speaking, economically speaking, socially speaking, and even spiritually speaking. that it's the very architecture, like the substructure, what is at the foundation of who we are as a country, of what we've become, how we've effectively stumbled into the space that we're in, but how now this decision from a couple of years ago, when it is put together with other streams of advocacy and work and initiatives towards reconciliation, when they're all taken together in this moment that we're in, that it requires us to lift ourselves up by the bootstraps and address and consider, reflect upon, ask ourselves and answer the most fundamental questions about who we are. Who am I? Who are you? Who are we? What is our proper relationship together? What is our proper and just relationship to the territories of what is now Canada, to the lands and waters and resources of the second largest country on the face of the earth? So that's that's what I think of about in terms of the big picture of the moment that we're in. And I think that also one of the other sort of streams that informs this moment is the deepening recognition in this country overall about the very real and the very personal implications of the stumbling that we've done as a country, of the lack of attentiveness to these issues. I'm going to talk a little bit in my talk, I'm going to talk about how here in Snuneymuxw in 1854, in the pre-Confederation era, that there was a nation-to-nation relationship built because the Crown wanted to find a foundation for its fledgling economy here in the colony of Vancouver Island. They knew that if they were going to seek to gain access to the coal resources of the Snuneymuxw peoples here in Nanaimo, that they would have to enter into a proper relationship with the Snuneymuxw people. That the Crown, as a first step, must establish proper relations of respect and recognition on a nation-to-nation basis. And so that was done. That was not a controversial thing at all. That was simply a manifestation of what people understood to be the proper application of English law about colonization in the world and international law. It was not a controversial thing to say we need to establish proper relations of recognition and respect on a nation-to-nation basis that recognizes the reality of Aboriginal title, that recognizes the reality of Aboriginal people's relationship to their territories, and I think most importantly, that establishes the reality that we matter to each other, that we understand that the way that the world and life is going to unfold requires us to really recognize and grab a hold of that concept, that our lives are deeply intertwined and wrapped up in each other, and we expect them to be, we want them to be. We don't want to be isolated from each other. We don't want to interfere with each other, but we want to understand and recognize that we're in this together and that we need clear and strong understandings and relationships to make sure that that goes well. That the world unfolds in a certain way, premised on the idea of respect and recognition. So that was done in the 1850s here in Nanaimo, but the storyline that I'm going to be talking about is that while there was some elements of a half-decent start in the beginning, that we shifted into a period of denial. The treaty here in Snuneymuxw that was signed on December 23rd, 1854, was the last treaty of the 14 treaties from the pre-Confederation era here on Vancouver Island, and then also what became British Columbia in the bigger picture. That was the last moment of treaty making in that way. And then if that idea of we matter to each other became displaced with, you know what, we kind of don't matter to each other. We don't matter to each other, and Aboriginal title doesn't matter. let's just do something different. There's no need for treaties here. And so that horrible decision, that decision itself became the foundation for two things. One, all of the legislation and policy and decision-making of the entire Crown approach to ownership of land, to their jurisdiction and the way they used it, the laws and the policies they articulated, were all premised on that idea, that Aboriginal peoples don't matter and that Aboriginal title doesn't matter. That was that's a profoundly, when we look at it now, post-Chilcotin Nation decision, when we look at the fact that all of the body of law and policy that exists from the past century is premised on ideas that were fundamentally rejected by the Supreme Court of Canada in 2014, we see the depth of what that denial, the uncertainty, the complexity, the totality of the moment that we're in together. And this will, I hope, become clear when I'm going through this part of my talk. So it's going to be about this trajectory of recognition, respect, denial, and now over the past 50 years or so, differing streams, the legal stream, political stream, economic stream, and now more recently the social stream, have all been pushing in this country towards reconciliation. They've all been talking on the surface about, the courts tell us that the whole body of Canadian Aboriginal law, its very purpose is about reconciliation. And we see the great political statement in Section 35 of the Constitution that talks about recognition and respect, recognition and affirmation of existing treaty rights and Aboriginal rights. We see, since the Haida Nation decision a decade ago, a little bit longer than a decade ago in 2004, a fundamental transformation in relations between the Crown and Indigenous peoples around decision-making. And then more recently, we've seen the unfolding of the remarkable Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada that very specifically turned its mind away from criminal justice matters, which is where it was born, effectively, in part by people from Snuneymuxw standing up and seeking to make people that harmed them in residential schools accountable. It shifted away from criminal justice towards a reaching for reconciliation in a social sense in this country. It's a remarkable thing, and it's something that does continue to trouble me, that notwithstanding that there were thousands of individual testimonies provided to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that there was not one prosecution, there was not one charge laid, there is not one single person that is in jail because of those thousands of testimonies about horrendous abuses and atrocities that took place in the residential schools in this country. The people that are wiser than me made a decision that that is not the object of this work. And in my mind, that decision, that dignified, graceful decision, is owed a lot of respect. And I think it puts a significant duty on the people of Canada to embrace the moment that they structured and put in front of us, one of reconciliation. They talked about, they very specifically designed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to be about engaging the people of Canada. And I think there's real wisdom in that, because in my experience, here as a chief for 4 years at Snuneymuxw, I understand how important that work is now. Having been in the mix of advocating for my people, in a way that, I'll admit, aspects of my advocacy are premised on the idea that we don't matter to each other. I was trained to fight as a lawyer. I was trained to fight as a politician by my people, by my father, my mother, my grandparents. You look after your family and you look after your people. all of the teachings that they passed on to me and the duties that they put upon my shoulders. I equipped myself to learn how to fight. I saw that my people were suffering. I saw that they were excluded. I saw that they needed help. I saw that they were under attack in many different ways. Some explicit, some not so explicit. And so I trained myself in that context how to fight. And being a lawyer for the last however many years, the legal process is hyper-adversarial. It's very much us and them. Someone's going to win this, someone's going to lose this. That's the basic paradigm of the law and the legal process. And you can make significant headway with it. Indeed, part of the story that I will be telling is the very story that it is the law and the legal process in this country that became the wedge and the leverage that started to drive the changes in political and economic realities in this country. That it was because of Indigenous people standing up, like the late great leader from the Nisga'a, Frank Calder, pressing Aboriginal title in the late 1960s and early 1970s, that fundamentally shifted the original Prime Minister Trudeau off of his position that had been expressed in the White Paper in 1969, that was fundamentally premised on the idea that Aboriginal peoples don't matter, and their distinctiveness is not part of the future of this country. And that the way that I think about and we think about this country in this moment, when we think about the future Canada that we want, that this idea of Aboriginal rights and treaty rights is nothing more than an anachronism. In a speech in 1969, I think it was, maybe 1970 in Vancouver, Prime Minister Trudeau talked about Aboriginal rights and treaty rights as historical might-have-beens. That they have no role, they do not have, there is no scope within the kind of country we want to build for difference between citizens of those kinds. And that Aboriginal peoples must be first and foremost, if not entirely, Canadian, like everybody else in this country. That was the conception, but that it was the legal process of pushing and fighting and using the courts to re-articulate the law as it had been a century earlier and continued to be, as we found out, that to his credit, Trudeau admitted he was wrong. He said, clearly I was wrong. And so let's get on with this, talking about Aboriginal title. And that became the foundation in 1973 of the first comprehensive claims policy. A fundamental shift in Canadian governance because of title, the first major shift that said, instead of pretending and premising all of our actions and behaviors on the idea that Aboriginal title is just a historical might have been, we will now sit down and negotiate in relation to the reality of that Aboriginal title. So there's the legal process is a necessary but insufficient and sometimes wholly inappropriate paradigm for thinking about some of these issues and for building the kind of country that we want. I saw very clearly that I was able to fight and to make headway, but there was also significant limitations on what I was able to achieve because we did not have a powerful enough social engagement and social change strategy as part of our work. And that aspects of our strategy were really inconsistent with developing the kind of relations and society we want in this part of the world. And so I came to a place where I understood as an advocate for my people that instead of fighting other peoples in this country, that what was necessary was to embrace other peoples in this country, to seek to build meaningful and deep understandings together about who we are respectively, and to found and ground a relationship premised on altruistic love, which is the opposite of we don't matter to each other. when I thought about the kinds of relations I want my children and grandchildren to have with your children and grandchildren, I came to a clear understanding that I want them to have their minds and their hearts turned toward each other. I want them to know each other. I don't want, just this past year, last summer, the Chief Justice of Canada made a remarkable statement about how the residential school system amounts to cultural genocide, that its object was to destroy the cultures of Indigenous peoples in this country. I think that's pretty clear. But I think it's pretty remarkable for a Chief Justice to speak in those terms. And that was followed up by the Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, now Senator Murray Sinclair, speaking in the same way. Cultural genocide. And that's an astonishing place to find ourselves in. Cultural genocide. And I know that a society can't inflict that kind of harm on an aspect of itself or another aspect of itself without also horribly harming itself and disfiguring itself. But what the Chief Justice talked about, the response, and I have the greatest respect for her, but what she said is that we need a country that that embraces the idea of tolerance. And I thought about that, and I've always thought, you see the different sort of impulses and responses and reactions to some of these things that different people have from different lenses. And certainly from the legal lens, the legal paradigm, the idea of tolerance, the idea of, please can everybody stop hurting each other? Can you just kind of go to your corners and stop hurting each other, for God's sakes? That's no doubt, that is a really important thing. Let's stop hurting each other. But in my own work and my own experience as a leader here in this part of the world, in Nanaimo, where we were experiencing over the course of time different manifestations of racism, in sometimes very public and loud ways, I knew that tolerance was not enough. I knew that for my children and for your children, I want more. I want more for them than merely tolerating each other. I want them to care about each other. I want them to know each other. I want them to understand that their lives are wrapped up in each other. I want them to have their hearts and their minds turned toward each other. I want them to love each other in an altruistic sense, where you don't just have you don't just care about their, it's more than not harming. It's being concerned about each other's well-being and advancement. And I have a son who's quite sick right now, and so I wasn't able to put together the PowerPoint slides that I wanted to for this talk. But I do have one slide. I'm going to see if I can use this device, and this is it. I think this is at the core of what should be guiding our work in this moment. And this is a remarkable statement from well over a century ago now, from 1910, up in Kamloops. The Shuswap chiefs gathered up to talk to Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier. And it's called now today the Wilfrid Memorial from 1910. It's a long document, about 4 pages, of what the chiefs expressed and shared with the Prime Minister of the day about their experiences with the relationship between Canada and them, the Crown and them in their territory. And part of the basic flow of the story they told was one where they talked about the early years of other people showing up in their territory in their part of the world, and they talked about what they expected the opportunity to be about of other people coming, the way that they thought about it, what their teachings told them about how they should be addressing and thinking about this moment. And they talked about other people coming to live in their house, meaning their territory. And ultimately, they talk about how what's expressed on the screen, which I'll talk about in a moment, didn't come to be. This was what their hope was. This is what they aspired to in their relations with the newcomers. But they were not embraced in this way. They were not treated in this way. It became the policy of denial that I've talked about. But they said to the Prime Minister that they shared this vision with him, and I think it's really a remarkable one, where they talk about, conceive of people coming to live in their lands as brothers, that we must treat them as part of our own family. These people wish to be partners with us in our country. We must therefore be the same as brothers to them and live as one family. We will share equally in everything, half and half, in land, water, and timber, and so on. What is ours will be theirs, and what is theirs will be ours. And what you can't see on this screen is it says, we will help each other to be great and good. We will help each other to be great and good. Really a beautiful, beautiful statement. Very profound vision of what the relationship should be, what it should look like. And one that I've always kept in my mind. And one that I think can be an aspirational statement that can help, well, not just the Aboriginal reality be repaired in this country, but one where, if people understand it correctly, they can appreciate and understand that it's Canada itself that has to be repaired. Canada has been damaged and harmed over the past century of its behavior as well. And that if we're going to be able to create that better reality, that it is going to be in Indigenous peoples and the Crown properly addressing its relationship, working together in respect and recognition of each other, creates the opportunity for those differing realities to help each other to be great and good. So that's the one slide that I have. I want to talk a little bit about, I think I want to start with the architectural aspect, because I'm fascinated by this stuff. Truly fascinated by the implications of this field and some of the issues that we're talking about, both some of the harm that's been done, but also some of the opportunity that is there. And then we'll talk a little bit more specifically about the Canadian governance implications of title. When I was a younger man, I came across this book called Among the Onkaminums. And it was written by Thomas Crosby. He's a Methodist missionary, one of the first ones here on Vancouver Island that worked here with the Snuneymuxw people. And Onkaminums means he's referencing the language that we speak, the Hulkaminum language. So the title is Among the Onkaminums. It was written about 100 years ago, but it was about the 1850s, 60s time period. And there's this one particular chapter, chapter 4, the title of which has always struck me. And the title, chapter 4 of Among the Onkaminums, is called Heathen Street versus Christian Street. I thought, oh my gosh, what on earth could he possibly be writing about in this chapter? And it's a remarkable little story. I'm not particularly interested for the purposes of this conversation on the religious aspect of what he was up to and what he was talking about. But Heathen Street happens to be the street that I grew up on. It's now today called Shoreline Drive, down on Indian Reserve number 1 of the Snuneymuxw First Nation. But it's the road along the beach. And along that road, 100 years ago, were many, and certainly 150 years ago, were numerous lawn houses. Big houses, we call it, lawn houses. And within these major, massive structures lived large families, extended families, multiple generations of one family under one roof living together. And this was considered to be an improper way to live and did not reflect or resonate with Thomas Crosby and what he was seeking to achieve. And so the basic idea and the story of this chapter is that when he was able to convert the Snuneymuxw people from heathenism to Christianity, an important part of that moment of conversion was leaving Heathen Street, getting out of this heathen mode of life and living and moving up to Christian Street, which is now Center Street, where the band office happens to be. And there on Christian Street was a row of beautiful little nuclear family homes designed around the idea of a husband and wife living with their children together. And this, in some ways, has to be understood to be part and parcel and a related initiative or project to the residential school system itself. It was a first step on the path toward the residential school system, taking people out of these major homes and structures that were designed around a particular way of life and worldview, cosmology, all of it, culture, that aunties and uncles are meant to be wrapped up in the lives of their nieces and nephews, and grandparents are supposed to be with their family. Shifting people out of that mode and sticking them into, like, physically changing the very structures of the places within which people reside to reflect a Western conception of what is a proper way to live as a human being. You don't live in these kinds of houses. You live in this kind of a house. That was a fundamental rupture in the social fabric and the culture of Indigenous peoples here in this very town, this very community. Now, that was a fundamentally important moment in the lives of my people, where the West had an impact upon the way that we thought about what family is, the way that we thought about what's the proper place for grandparents in relation to our lived lives. Another point about architecture, and this gets to the residential schools again, is just the sheer purposeful design of residential schools and communities to be this dominating structure over landscapes. The sheer size and situation of them. In almost every residential school I can think of, whether Cooper Island or St. Michael's up in the north, the Alberni Residential School, they always chose the most prominent place, very public space, and they became this dominating structure that if you lived in that community, you could not avoid the reality of the school. It became I think that was obviously very purposeful. I want to say that here in Snuneymuxw, where we're at right now, this particular very space that we're sitting in is called, and I want you to try and say this name, it's called Kwul'a'sul'tun. 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 And it means something like place of, like grassy place. It's a reference to the grasses that used to be in this village site. But this place is the main winter village of the highest ranking group of the Snuneymuxw people. So one of the 5 groups of Snuneymuxw spent the winter here, in this space, in this village site. The other 4 spent the winters at Departure Bay. And 2 quick stories about that. One, I was giving a talk down at Departure Bay a few years ago, and one of the things I said was it's particularly meaningful for me to be standing here in this space to be talking about these issues because of the fact that when the Snuneymuxw people think about home, this is where their hearts and their minds turn toward, Departure Bay. And it was to the public. It was part of my social change, my outreach, my trying to create understandings and relations. So go to talk to public groups and whatnot. And someone came up to me after and said, I've lived here for a long time, and I had no idea that this was your true home, that this place was your major village site. And it was a remarkable thing for me. I didn't say anything to that fellow, but I was shocked and stunned at the depth of the simple lack of knowledge of the most basic facts of history. Here, how quickly that entire reality had been erased from the lived lives of other people that had come to live here. I was shocked. It really told me a lot about how much work there is to be done to educate and inform the general public about some of the most basic facts, let alone the complexities of what we're talking about. And then the second story simply being that Kwul'a'sul'tun, this village site, this is where the treaty was negotiated in the 1850s, but that this is where very quickly, by the 1860s, we were being pushed out of. But that we, under the treaty agreement itself from 1854, one of the basic terms on the text of the treaty, which is different from the oral history of the treaty, but where there's alignment between the two, is this recognition of the Aboriginal title, reality of the Snuneymuxw peoples to at least their village sites and the lands they depend upon, adjacent to village sites. That there's that commonality. And so we consider, while this is not recognized by the Crown, the place that you're gathered up in and sitting in right now is in fact some of the first recognized Aboriginal title that exists in Canada. That's something important to know, but that it was already by 1864, Snuneymuxw chiefs were standing up to advocate for the implementation of that treaty. Another important thing to think about is that over the last, since the 1850s and 1860s, here in Nanaimo, Snuneymuxw, and this is true across the country, there isn't a single First Nations community I've ever been to where this isn't basically true, in an where there's a connected or adjacent urban context. We all know NIMBY factor politics and how they play out in terms of regional and local decision making. Well, for 150 years, every single one of those decisions ended up on top of or adjacent to the community that I'm from, that I grew up on, to the south of us here, little 40-acre reserve. And surrounded by industry, coal mining. There's a train track going right through the middle of this little 40-acre reserve. There's mills to the north and south, log booming on the estuary in front of, recycling plants, all kinds of really, the kinds of uses that you don't put around a residential community. They've all landed within or adjacent to Indian reserves. I want to say something about, too, a remarkable thing when when I was first chief, I was looking at the land base of my people, the Snuneymuxw First Nation. A very, very limited land base. Only 40 acres that I grew up on, and then some other little acreage up on the mouth of the Nanaimo River. A big portion of which every winter when there's a big tide and a big rain goes underwater. Most of the reserve goes underwater. So very, very constrained and difficult reality in terms of that land. And so we're always trying to figure out how to get more land and how to plan better for the land that we have. And so when I was first chief, I asked a famous architect that I know who's built some of the most remarkable buildings on the face of the earth, including the Lotus Temple in India. Mr. Fariborz Saba came to talk. I asked him to come and help me look at and dream about and envision how this landscape could be different. And part of that was the fact that I took him on a walking tour of the community I grew up in. I had with me my elderly band manager, some other advisors, a couple of other counselors, and myself and Mr. Saba. We went around the community and looked at it so he could be oriented to our place. Then we got back to the band office and we sat down to talk about the different lands that we'd seen and about the little walking tour we'd just been on. And I asked him, Mr. Saba, what do you think? And he said to us, I want you to know that if I lived in this community, I would want to kill myself. And I was like, what? What did he just say? It was such a shocking statement. My poor this elderly lady who was my band manager, she was crying. She was so upset that someone would say something like that. I was so offended. This is my home. This is where I grew up. He said, I want to explain this to you. He said, from a planning perspective, there is no planning in this community. It is total chaos. In terms of the physical structures of this place, they do not in any way reflect love for the inhabitants. These buildings, these houses do not reflect care or love for the people that live within them. The layout and the physical buildings and the structures show no reflection or connection to the space and to the lands and the territory. This is not a place of design. There is no design here. There is only chaos here. There is only manifestations and reflections of the basic ideas I talked about, that we don't matter. We don't care about you. Are manifest in the physicality of this community. It was a shocking thing to hear, but I respect him for sharing that view. And in part, I acknowledge and I understand over the course of years, I understand that he's not incorrect. Suicide is a massive problem from one side of this country to the other for Aboriginal peoples. I'm telling you, it's a difficult environment to grow up in and to live in. It's one where you're on a daily basis faced with grinding poverty, social disorder of different kinds. All of the manifestations of the residential school impacts are in your face every single moment of every day. And so that's another dimension or aspect or another reflection that many Indian Reserve communities themselves, the physicality, the lack of proper planning, if a people were able to say, how will we build the most beautiful community? Would it be in this spot? Or would it be in the winter village site of our people where it's been for thousands of years? Those are important things to reflect upon and think upon. I want to leave time for questions and discussion. I know that I've covered a lot of issues already. I want to say something very specifically to wrap up about Aboriginal title and its implications on Canadian governance. Aboriginal title is understood now to be, first, a legal reality. Remarkable moment, 2 summers ago, this month, for the very first time after 40 years of litigation, the Supreme Court of Canada stood up and said, here it is. We are legally declaring and recognizing the reality and the coming into specific shape the Aboriginal titles of the Tsilhqot'in peoples in this part of the world, over 2,000 square kilometers of land. For the very first time, recognized by a court. And they rejected the old arguments of the Crown that were embraced by the BC Court of Appeal, that Aboriginal title, if it matters, maybe it exists, but it's a very small scope. In the BC Court of Appeal, the Justice Groberman said, if you want to find your Aboriginal title, look at your feet when you're fishing and look at that rock that you're standing on when you're fishing. That's your Aboriginal title. Aboriginal peoples do not have territorial relationships with landscapes. They've got very, very site-specific, intensive use is the broadest scope of Aboriginal title. They rejected that entirely and they said, Aboriginal title is territorial. The full beneficial interest of the land transfers to the Indigenous peoples. There is decision-making power and jurisdiction related to that space. That there are deep and profound sustainability and continuity principles built into the legal concept of Aboriginal title. That the Indigenous government in its decision-making is constrained and limited by these principles because they have a duty to future generations of Indigenous peoples to ensure that the benefit and enjoyment of those lands is available to them in the future. That today's governments are constrained in their decision-making in a way that ensures the continuity of that special relationship between those peoples and those lands. They talk about the land being inalienable. But here's the big shift. In the Haida Nation duty to consult framework, the basic premise and idea of Canadian governance prior to 2004 in the Haida Nation decision was that the Crown's view was that they could do whatever they wanted if the situation is that there is no established treaty or there is no legal declaration about a right. In that context, the Crown can do whatever it wants. We can issue tree farm licenses, we can issue Crown grants, we can do whatever we want. In 2004, the Supreme Court said, no, that's not correct. You have to turn your mind to the reality of the potential of the Aboriginal rights coming into shape, coming into form and being recognized at some point. And that because the honor of the Crown is always engaged with respect to its dealings with Indigenous peoples, in this context, the honor of the Crown gives rise to a duty to consult and accommodate with Indigenous peoples. But let's be clear about this. The fundamental model is premised on the idea that there is only one decision maker, and that is the Crown. And what they said in Haida Nation is something fundamentally different from that, or what they said in the Tsilhqot'in Nation decision, I mean. Just two years ago now, the decision was a recognition and coming into shape of Aboriginal title. And they said a part of that relationship is effectively, everything that they wrote about effectively means that it's a governmental relationship of a people to territory, and that they have decision-making power over that land. So there is now multiple decision makers, multiple authorities and jurisdictions. Canadian governance is not unitary in this sense, that there is now Indigenous governments across the country whose decision-making power must be taken into account. And what that gives rise to is not some honor of the crown derived duty, a fiduciary duty with specific rights or a duty to consult with unspecified rights. In fact, this new reality of multiple decision makers creates a new framework of consent. Consent is required. The consent of Indigenous peoples is a necessary element of decision making in this country now. And this is reflected in the other major, most recent political development, Canada's adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that talks about free, prior, and informed consent. And so this is a major shift and a change. All of this, when we talk about the themes of reconciliation, requires us to look at how all of these different streams come together in this moment now. That the depth of the uncertainty that's created by the Tsilhqot'in Nation decision, what it says is it says now, so this decision is historic and sweeping and of incredible consequence, creates enormous uncertainty. What does everybody do now? Now what? The court has just indicated that massive chunks and areas of British Columbia are no longer Crown land. That at some point they're going to be recognized as expansive Aboriginal title land. So what do we do today? How do we behave today in relation to that reality? And they said very clearly, they said the only way to overcome that uncertainty, the uncertainty that if the Crown and proponents proceed today without the consent of Indigenous peoples, they have to understand that when that title is established, those decisions are subject to being canceled and damages owing to the Indigenous peoples for the harm done to their Aboriginal title lands. Oh my God, I can't even begin to understand how the shudder that must run through the spines of every industry in this province when they read those lines. Should I spend $30 billion on this LNG plant without the consent of Indigenous peoples in that context? Should I approve a mine that's going to extract billions of dollars of materials out of the ground that's part of Aboriginal title without the consent of Aboriginal peoples? It is total risk. And what the court said is the only way to overcome that risk and uncertainty is to shift into a model of consent-based decision-making in this country. That is the only way to avoid that total risk. And we see now all of these streams of reconciliation really clearly bringing us to a point, a defining moment in the country where I really think that it returns us to the space after Section 35 was added in 1982 in the repatriation process. There was a promise of further constitutional conferences between Indigenous peoples and the Crown to talk about the substance and the subject matter of Section 35, to get on the same page about it. Those political conferences in Ottawa in the late 1980s, the mid to late 80s, were a total failure. There was no political will to come to a commonality. And so that's an important part of the reason why there's been so much litigation. The politicians aren't going to be able to get together and solve these things, then the courts will step up. It becomes issues and conflict for the courts to deal with. I think we're at a moment now in this country where we have to grapple with and understand that the kinds of conversations that are required now in this moment are of that nature. It's about redefining. It's about taking what's already at the core of the way Canada imagines itself, although incomplete, this multi-juridical reality, multicultural reality of English and French, common law, civil law, multiple jurisdictions and legal orders and traditions. But it's an understanding that we need to figure out a way of including Indigenous peoples properly and fully in that new reality, in what's going to be the future of this country. And so when we think about the implications of Canadian governance, we have to understand that the implications, in my view, are not just about the governance of Canada, but the implications are about Canada itself, the very essence of what is Canadian, what is this country, and of working together to build a new political relationship, to ground the reconciliation of the future in a fundamentally new political contract and relationship between us. So I'll leave it at that for now. I hope that what I've shared with you is useful for you in your lives and your work, and invite any questions or comments from the floor. I think that Jen will be coordinating that, and thank you very much.
Bonjour. Gajegabewik. Digo. My name is Aladia Smoke. I'm from Obishikakang First Nation, and grew up around Sioux Lookout, Ontario. So thank you for everything you've shared. And because of your background, I feel confident asking this question. I want to hear it from you because research is one thing, but hearing it from actual people is better. So I took your point of the hostile relationships built into the legal system. And I think we deal as architects every day with similar hostile relationships built into the building industry that we navigate. Can you share some of your knowledge regarding some traditional modes of governance or traditional modes of negotiation that you feel might be a suitable alternative?
I think that, my major point there was for us to start to understand that we need a more comprehensive approach than simply the law or politics. When I became chief, the story about the treaty and how it had been denied, by the early 1960s, my people had to go to the court to have the simple recognition that the treaty even exists be the issue for the court to decide, because it had been entirely denied by the Crown. And so they had that recognition. They went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and Canada, that court said, yes, there is a treaty, it does mean something today, and what it means is that the provincial law cannot apply to the Indigenous peoples if it would interfere with their treaty rights. Very powerful jurisdictional ouster, pushing the provincial jurisdiction away from the treaty reality and the continuity of those treaty rights. Unbelievable, amazing decision. You could not, what a powerful, clear, ringing statement from the Supreme Court of Canada. I remember when in law school reading about the Quebec secession reference, a sort of related topic to the kinds of things we're talking about, and about how the Quebec secession reference brought the Supreme Court to really ask basic fundamental questions about what Canada is. Talked about some of the main pillars of the constitutional framework of the country. Democracy, constitutional democracy, and the rule of law was an important element of that. Beautiful, beautiful statement about what this country is. And I was shocked, having learned all of those details in law school and then years later becoming the chief of the nation. It was my grandfather that was the chief at the time in the 60s that brought the White and Bob litigation to the Supreme Court of Canada. I show up 2 generations later, 50 years later, and I swear to God, the prevailing relationship of the Snuneymuxw with the Crown was effectively this. There had never been a treaty signed. There had never been a Supreme Court of Canada decision in the 1960s that recognized that treaty. And Section 35 of the Constitution had never happened. We were back. We went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and half a century, and we were victorious, major historical victory. And yet, the lived reality was 2 generations later, it's like none of that had ever happened. The Crown was still acting like none of that existed. The treaty didn't exist, the legal decision didn't exist, the constitutional framework of the country didn't exist. And so I understood that as powerful as the law can be, it's not sufficient, it's not enough. We need a broader, comprehensive strategy to implement those rights that includes strong law, but also strong politics, strong economics, but strong, I think longer term, it's the social reality. And I think that if you're struggling with adversarial relationship patterns, it's because people are in a mode where they feel ultimately we don't matter to each other, and long-term relationships are not what are at issue here. What's at issue is a very short-term, small scope, financial transaction. It's transactional in nature. And I think that, so my approach was to really clearly understand that I'm never going to create the world I want for my children by beating people over the head with a lawsuit, or strong politics, or strong economics. Those you might make headway, but you're not going to create the world that we should be seeking and striving to create. And that's where the social aspect of the advocacy became so important, is understanding and clearly being clear about the implications of those negative patterns, those adversarial patterns on lived social realities, and then also on the potential for a reframing of the relations and the issues, not in the hard tax of economics and financial realities and short-term non-relational realities, to the social consequences of those patterns of relations. That's what it makes me think about.
I'd like to ask you a different kind of question, a little more specific, but I think both your legal knowledge and historical understanding might bridge to where we live as architects and urban designers. We live in a world, all of us in this room who work in those fields deal with land use controls and density controls and a lot of civic land use controls. Now the world's changing, and I'll just speak to Vancouver. The most significant development sites in Vancouver for the next decade or two will be, First Nations will have a crucial role. They either own it outright or they're key players in consortia. And I think you probably know about the Burrard Bridge North site, but most particularly the Jericho lands, which is the single most valuable development site in Canada, $2 or $3 billion, with potentially up to 15,000 people living there. Current interpretations is that most or many civic land use controls do not apply to these projects, and we're still feeling our way into this. Now, the social and moral and intellectual issue before us is, how do we get a process of dialogue that will represent all interests and also talk through what is to be done, can be done, etc. It's proceeding behind closed doors now. There's no public process on these sites largely, and there's no way through. And for example, the city lawyers come and say, well, you can't have water or sewer, if you're going to build all those towers there. So these things are happening behind the scenes. I'm just curious, what would a positive way to get down to that micro level of land use and densities and those sort of things, how could we have a positive dialogue at that scale?
Yeah, I think that the broader relationship has to be a part of the picture. That whenever these are the kinds of steps or actions that bring the attention of the general public to certain issues. And approaches and patterns of the way those issues are addressed are simple manifestations of, as you say, I think what you're alluding to is the brokenness or the disconnection of the Musqueam, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, Tsawwassen, others from being a fulsome part of and a just part, a reconciled part of that urban landscape. I have the greatest admiration for the work of all of those leaders. Those are all my relations on, like, this part of Vancouver Island is more connected to the lower mainland culturally and linguistically and historically than we are to the southern part of Vancouver Island. Like, that's, the Snuneymuxw people, our summer fishing village is on the Fraser River. So we'd go over the summer for the sockeye runs over to, if you read the Fort Langley journals in the 1820s, half the discussion is about the Snuneymuxw because our village site was near there. But these are difficult issues, and we're not getting proper direction from the courts in terms of the duty to consult and the notion about, so the Crown has a duty to consult because we must have honorable dealings and we must act honorably as a Crown in all of our relations with Indigenous peoples. But then there was this bizarre BC Court of Appeal decision in the Nuu-chah-nulth that talked about, does that duty apply or not to municipalities? And for, I think, very wrong-headed reasons, they said, no, it doesn't. I think you know, and everyone in this room knows, that the relationships that at the end of the day that really matter, that are of a really significant consequence, are the local lived relationships and engagements between municipalities and their citizens and adjacent First Nations when there's that kind of an urban context. And so we continue to struggle with trying to figure out what are the things we should be talking about. You know, other than the Tsawwassen was a total, in some ways, a real anomaly in the BC Treaty process that was set up 25 years ago to address the issues of title and jurisdiction, to reconcile the sovereignties of Indigenous peoples and the Crown. It became something entirely different. And so that there's that outstanding work still of understanding what the implications are. And not just, you know, as much as I admire and appreciate the mayor of Vancouver saying Vancouver is unceded Aboriginal title lands of the local Coast Salish peoples, ultimately what really matters is what you do, not what you say. Here in Nanaimo, for some reason, the flag of the Snuneymuxw people flies at City Hall, a decision that was made when I was not part of the Snuneymuxw government. And for the life of me, I thought, oh, it must mean that Kwul'a'sul'tun is coming back to us now. We're implementing and respecting the treaty rights of the Snuneymuxw, I guess. You know, there's I don't want to in any way, I guess, I want to be clear, I don't want to be disrespectful of what can be seen to be mere window dressing, the form and the process. But what ultimately really matters is the substantive relationships. And the complexities you're talking about are a failure of the politicians to sit down over the past generation and be serious about the Aboriginal titles of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh. And so there will continue to be discord and uncomfortableness and things happening in ways that we could probably imagine them happening in fundamentally different ways. But they won't happen that way until we get serious about implementing the Tlii'shin Nation decision across the board. That's the implication for Canadian governance. If we don't build the future together in light of the Tlii'shin Nation Aboriginal title decision, then there's going to be deep uncertainty of the kinds that you're talking about. That if the Crown takes a position that instead of coming up with global, clear, comprehensive, and coherent policy about these issues and actions about the issue of Aboriginal title, that the most substantive thing the government of British Columbia has said in the two global conferences between the Premier and Cabinet and Indigenous leadership in the last 2 Septembers in a row, after the Tlii'shin Nation decision, the most substantive by far statement made or announcement made is that BC is creating a new Aboriginal youth sports scholarship. Last September, the phrase Aboriginal title didn't even come out of the mouth of the Premier of British Columbia at a forum whose very purpose is to address these issues. We've just the other day, there was an announcement by the First Nations Summit, by the government of British Columbia and the government of Canada about renewing and making the treaty process more efficient. And all that that document did, they apparently spent a year working on this document, post-Chilcotin. They've spent half the time since the Chilcotin Nation decision working to figure out how to change this failed treaty process that has been clunking along for 25 years, being productive of close to nothing. And this document is entirely about process. We think we will establish a committee that will explore an issue that may be further considered by the parties over the next year or two. There's nothing about resolving Aboriginal title. It's all on the process side of the treaty process. The treaty process was recognized by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in Washington, D.C. a number of years ago in response to a case brought by the Hulkaminam Treaty Group to the south of us a number of years ago. They said, this is pre-Chilcotin Nation decision, they said, we will grant standing to the Hulkaminam Treaty Group because there are no effective domestic remedies in Canada for Indigenous peoples to have their Aboriginal title dealt with. They said the legal process after 4 decades has never provided a single remedy to Indigenous peoples. After 4 decades of litigation, not one grain of sand in the second largest country on the face of the earth in these 4 decades has ever been declared to be Aboriginal title by a Canadian judge. And they said the treaty process for its part is not about implementing Aboriginal title at all. In fact, it's about setting it aside. The Crown position and mandate is that Aboriginal peoples, if we're going to enter into a treaty with you, you must set aside your Aboriginal title and we will give you fee simple lands in its place. So the response to that, by the way, that embarrassing decision was an important part of emboldening the Supreme Court to make the Chilcotin Nation decision. But that recognition, that resolute determination to address the issues in front of us has not been reflected in the most recent report from the BC treaty process. And the longer they keep their head in the sand and try to avoid the substantive reality of what title means, the further we're going to have these complexities and conflict emerge in important landscapes between us.
I just want to, in the interest of time, thank you. Thanks, Doug. This was a really informative, I think, and engaging discussion, and I think very candid, which I think many folks in the room appreciate. So thank you. And
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, great.